Alright, so we did the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on our country risk analysis. I'm Matt Tully.
I'm Dave Niedermeyer.
And I'm Peter Soto. So to kick it off, I'm just going to give a little brief overview of Saudi Arabia as a country. We've got a population of about 33 million people. The graphic area is about over 800,000 square miles, and the capital is in Riyadh. The official language is Arabic, and the official religion is Islam with a strong Sunni presence. The currency is the Rial. And the GDP as of end of the year 2017 was about $683 billion in US currency. So to step into their economic overview, we're looking at the largest economy in the Middle East. Their economy, however, is based almost entirely off oil right now. According to this graph from the side, you can see that as of 2019, they're producing about 10.4 million barrels. This was around the same amount as they were producing around the end of 2018, which I'll dive a little into later on. But they are part of the OPEC, which is the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they are one of the larger contributors to this demographic. And the oil industry makes up about 50% of their GDP at $160,000 and 70% of their exports. So to kind of talk about where some of their issues are currently right now, their GDP has been on its slowest decline since 2015, and at 2017 it hit a recession level at negative 0.7%. The International Monetary Fund has suggested a growth rate of about 1.9 for this year, which has been slightly downgraded, and this is due to fluctuations with oil prices and some political strains, which we'll get into later as well. The big things that are affecting oil right now are global trade wars and America being a large producer and exporter of oils as well, which is kind of beginning to surpass Saudi Arabia. So as far as looking at inflation, their inflation has also been increasing, and this is primarily due to a 5% value-added tax on consumer goods and services. So with this being said, they're kind of projecting the inflation rate to settle around 2% over the next couple of years. And the state debt is currently about 19.4% of GDP as of 2018, and is expected to increase by about a percent this coming year.
The next economic risk that we'll cover is their monetary policy and the instability of any exchange rate against the US dollar. So their monetary policy is set by the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, which is a government entity. The Saudi Rial is pegged against the US dollar, so for the exchange rate. So in essence, the Rial interest rates closely track the US interest rates, oftentimes on a small premium. And then the factors influenced by this dollar Rial exchange rate is price stability, meaning they need to keep that exchange rate stable in order to ensure that they continue to get domestic or foreign investments. And then balance of payments. This one, a good example here is in the 1980s, the dollar decline, playing a large role in reducing the Saudi current account deficit, which I'll touch on the next slide as well. And the last factor is confidence. So oil income is denominated and received in dollars. That means that the Rial essentially floats against all the other currencies. So this exchange rate needs to be strong, or else uncertainty and estimating costs for their imports will happen. So going back to the current account balance for Saudi Arabia that I was touching on and how it relates to the dollar exchange rate. So as you can see here in 2008, it clearly dropped pretty heavily, their deficit or their current account. And that's because the dollar appreciated against the Saudi Rial, and that would explain why that decreased so much. Here are some key takeaways from the 2019 budget meeting with King Salman. The cost of living allowances were continuing to be awarded to civil servants and military. The 2019 budget to work towards increased growth. And then lastly, the state spending should grow 7% to 295 billion American dollars, or 1.1 trillion Saudi Arabian Rial. And this is to help boost the economy for 2019 after it's been sluggish in 2018. The government budget deficit as a percentage of GDP has decreased from negative 14.8% in 2015 to negative 9.2% in 2018. And over that same time frame, the government debt to GDP has increased from 5.8% to 19.4%, as Peter said earlier.
So to kind of touch into the workforce base, currently right now, Saudi Arabia has been imposing taxes on foreign workers, and this has really had a negative effect on their presence and has caused a constriction in the overall workforce. Right now, the taxations on private companies can charge up to about $100 a month per foreign employee, and this is kind of becoming an issue as 30% of the Saudi Arabian population is foreign workers. With that being said, they've had about 900,000 expatriates that are currently living in Saudi Arabia kind of perform an exodus and leave the country. One of the big downfalls of this is that we're losing a lot of really crucial skills and a lot of things that we've brought people over for their benefits, and this is kind of overall tampering and damaging the economic growth that Saudi Arabia is trying to look for right now. In addition, the unemployment rate is about 12.7%, which is a little bit down over the past couple of months, but has been a groundbreaking and decade high for Saudi Arabia, so this is very uncharacteristic and problematic. Right now, it has basically caused a lot with these foreign taxations on their employees and just in private businesses as a whole, and as a result, they're not hiring as many employees, even though oil prices are rising. And as you can see down here, this was kind of something recently in the news. President Donald Trump tweeted that it's important that the OPEC countries, which are mainly in the Middle East, increase their oil productivity to kind of combat the rising oil prices. This is a problem because some of the OPEC countries, as I said, have remained stagnant with their oil production growth as far as the end of 2018 and thus far into 2019, with Saudi Arabia about 10.4 million barrels a day, but this number Trump is really recommending that they heavily increase to kind of combat these different issues. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dan a little bit to talk more about some of the political side and some of the risks there.
So moving on to the political side, the political structure in Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. So that means that the king is the head of the state and the government. The king is King Solomon, and he's been the king since 2015. And the constitution is based on the holy book Quran, which is the holy Islamic text. So the country is governed on the basis of Islamic law. So one of the key political risks that is currently plaguing the country is that of corruption. This has been a risk that has been a problem in the country throughout their history, and it's still a problem today. Saudi Arabia is described as being moderate risk for corruption right now, with a key emphasis on problems with abuse of power, nepotism, and then also use of middlemen. So currently, Saudi Arabia has bribery laws in place, as well as civil service laws, but they really don't have any laws that regulate conflict of interest. And then on top of this, with the bribery laws, a lot of times when problems arise, it sometimes gets swept on the rug, and more corruption is created out of it. So really, they're kind of in a sticky situation. However, in January of this year, Saudi authorities charged 126 government officials with corruption and abuse of power. And this is a continuation of the 2017 program that Prince Solomon started to combat corruption in the country. So obviously, corruption is a huge problem in Saudi Arabia right now, but Prince Solomon is trying to make an effort to combat that. So as a business, it's definitely something that we should be worried about, but something to keep in mind that Solomon is making an effort to combat this. And then another political risk that we found was the risk of violence, particularly pertaining to Saudi Arabia's geographic area. So obviously Saudi Arabia is in the Middle East, where there is a plethora of extremist groups, including ISIS and among others, and then also their geographic location with many countries that have a lot of civil unrest and political unrest. And one thing that many people don't often realize is that actually Saudi Arabia, within their borders, It's a particularly safe, more on the safer side in terms of countries in the Middle East. Their homicide rates are much lower than the average throughout the Middle East, and their burglary rates are much lower than the average as well. However, one of the main issues that plagues the country is that of domestic violence. This is really based on the discrimination against women that has been there throughout Saudi Arabia's history. And so this is a huge problem, and this is really shown by, so Saudi Arabia didn't even address this issue until 2013 when they made domestic violence a crime. And then even just as surprising, just this past year in June, they finally allowed women to drive for the first time. So this is extremely alarming to anybody who isn't from that area. And so as a business person trying to get into business in Saudi Arabia, this brings up a huge ethical and reputational risk for that business, especially a business that prides itself on equal equality for both men and women.
I'll touch on some armed insurrections as another political risk. So there's current unrest in Al Qatif, which is an urban area located outside the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Essentially, this conflict is between the Saudi government and the Shia community, and it began in 2017 when a child and a man were murdered by Saudi government officials or soldiers. And so still continuing today, obviously that's a problem if because it's causing uncertainty among the people, and mainly in this eastern province, but all throughout Saudi Arabia. And then another obvious one that Dan touched on earlier, ISIS is a problem in Saudi Arabia, and even in August of 2018, as a current event here, is he threatened Saudi Arabia, saying Saudi Arabia is trying to secularize its inhabitants and ultimately destroy Islam, which obviously is untrue, and I'll get to that later, but
So as I touched on, obviously one of the main issues with Saudi Arabia is their geographic location and the violence that comes with that. And one of those main conflicts that they have currently is that with Yemen. In 2011, there's been political instability that has caused Yemen to be in a lot of political unrest. However, the conflict with Saudi Arabia really started in 2014 when the Houthi rebels took over the northern territory of Sada, which is the closest city towards the southern border of Saudi Arabia. And this was a huge issue with Saudi Arabia because the Houthi rebel forces were our Shia minority rebel group, and Saudi Arabia is predominantly Sunni. So this was a huge issue, and in response to this, the Saudi Arabian government began airstrike campaigns to try and restore the Hadi government that was in place before the Houthis took over. And this has really led to an ongoing conflict between the two nations. So according to the UN, over 7,000 civilians have been killed throughout this process and over 11,000 have been injured. And this is a direct result as to Saudi Arabia's influence into Yemen. And then going off of that, another ongoing conflict that Saudi Arabia has had throughout its history really is that with Iran. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are two of the main powerhouses in the Middle East. And their main conflict stems from their differences in their religion, as as Matt kind of talked about. So Iran is a Shia Muslim majority, and then Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Muslim majority, and those two groups have had conflicts throughout the history of the Middle East. And this conflict also pertains to the conflict that is going on in Yemen, as Saudi Arabia actually accused Iran of providing weapons and providing support to the Yemen rebels that are currently there. So while Iran and Saudi Arabia are actually not directly fighting each other, they're involved in a lot of different proxy wars within the Middle East. And this is, while this is not a huge problem on Saudi Arabia's home front right now, it can turn into a big problem, and this would be a serious concern for any business that wanted to invest there.
So I'm going to talk about the Saudi Vision 2030 reform plan. This is a plan put in place by Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who it was published in 2016, and it essentially is their goals for the year 2030. And it's to become less dependent on hydrocarbons, which is oil and a component in oil and gas. So currently their public sector, which is made up the petrochemical businesses, provides roughly 2/3 of the GDP. And considering that a large portion of Saudi Arabia is a large part of their population is rather young, they're relying on these two businesses will not be sustainable. So in essence, the reform plan is built on 3 principles, and it's being the heart of the Arab and Islamic world, use the financial resources that they currently have to become a global investment powerhouse and diversify their portfolio, and then use Saudi Arabia's strategic location in the middle of the world to become a global hub connecting 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe.
So to kind of just conclude and go over some of the bigger picture items from what we've talked about, we wanted to kind of go through a little risk rating and give our final our final opinion on whether or not we think that this is an attractive and opportune business partnership. To look at some of the positives, there are a lot of really good plans and a lot of good mentalities towards how they want to reform Saudi Arabia. As Matt just touched on, the 2030 plan, it does prove a lot of good ideas, because one of the big things is that with such a young population in Saudi Arabia and the oil industry really just becoming too competitive and rising oil prices, they're going to try to reorganize and redesign their exportation structure so that they can get more just more goods and services to be revenue boosters for them. So it's a good idea for them. And as well as Dan had said, Prince Salomon's emphasis on kind of cracking down and mitigating some of those corruption risks, he has proved to be somewhat successful, but it is still an ongoing struggle. With that, the geographic location is still riddled with terrorism, ISIS, and there are still threats and different political unrest throughout the whole Middle East. Unemployment, as I briefly touched on earlier, has hit a decade-long high for Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't seem to be trying to find a near solution to this. And as Dan had touched on, the domestic violence and the overall lack of women representation is just becoming somewhat of an issue too, and there is a very heavy emphasis on how the Saudi Arabian Real is kind of based on what's happening with the strength and weaknesses of the US dollar. So there's a lot of things that are kind of falling on each other and causing a lot of different emphasis against doing business in Saudi Arabia. So we classified it as an overall high risk because the oil is obviously clearly their largest export by far, and this is really just uncertain as to where this future lies, and the political unrest has not seemed to subside, and these 2030 plans are not planning on stopping their deficit, because they've kind of noted that this is something that they're more working towards the future as far as the deficit, but this is a big concern that needs to be factored in as well. So that is, with that, I will say that's the end of our presentation.